Welcome to Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. My name is Chris Hackala, and I'm your podcast host. In this series of conversations, we speak with folks who have made the leap from a traditional faculty member position to a role in a Center for Teaching and Learning. The conversations focus on how individuals moved from faculty to a center and how that move impacted their work, their career trajectory, and their personal and professional identity. Along the way, we talk about tips, advice, and challenges that come from working in a center. Sit back and enjoy these chats on Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. So today, I am incredibly happy to be talking with Carol Hurney, who is the Associate Provost of Faculty Development and Diversity and the Founding Director for the Center for Teaching and Learning at Colby College in Maine, and the incoming president of the POD Network. Carol, I'm really happy to have you today. Thanks for coming and chatting with me.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Chris. I'm looking forward to this very much.
So, Carol, we've worked on a couple of committees and we've done some committee meetings together, and so I've gotten to know a little bit about you. But what I think is really interesting is, as I begin to talk to people, and I say this in a number of these sessions, it's always interesting to me to hear where people come from. There's a lot of talk in some of these circles about having faculty development pathways within higher ed, but I really like the diversity of our backgrounds. So can you talk a little bit about where you came from, how you ended up in faculty development, and how you ended up at your current role?
Yeah, sure. I actually enjoy telling the story. So I'm a first-gen student, and I went to the University of Rochester, and I majored in like 17 things before I ended up getting a degree in biology, which turned out to be a really a good thing for me. I enjoyed biology, and then right after I finished my bachelor's degree, I taught 8th grade for a couple of years. Ooh. And that was, it's an interesting experience, and I think back a lot about it when I'm working with undergrads, and it was when I realized that I wanted to be a teacher. I really wasn't sure. I had kind of interesting experiences in my undergraduate experience with a master teacher that I worked with, whose idea of teaching was to open up the textbook and read it to the students.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it amazing that people did that? I've seen it too. It's amazing.
So, but I think I realized during those years I was teaching 8th grade that I didn't really have a full grasp of the field of biology. So I didn't really know what it meant to get a PhD, but off I went to get one. And I went to the University of Virginia. And as you know, they have a center there. It's now called the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. At the time, it was called the Teaching Resource Center. I didn't know anything about it while I was a grad student there. So I went to UVA. I got my PhD. I did some teaching. I got a teaching award. And then I went off to do my postdoc. And I realized when I did my postdoc that I wasn't really doing what I wanted. I wanted to be teaching. So I was fortunate enough to get a position at James Madison University. And at that time, I was hired as a visiting assistant professor. And so I wasn't being supported to do any sort of scholarship or research. At the time, the center at UVA was looking for a faculty consultant to work in the STEM disciplines. And I think they were actually looking for someone who was at UVA at the time. I mean, I wasn't employed there anymore. I'd already finished my degree, but they hired me. So I lived right in between JMU and UVA. So 2 days a week, I'd get up and I'd go into the Charlottesville area and work with Marva Barnett and her wonderful staff, where I slowly began to piece together this career that if I'd had words to describe it, I would have tried to when I was in grad school. But when I started to realize, this is like people's jobs. So we learned how to do SGIDs there. I learned how to put together a good workshop. I spent a lot of time thinking about TA development and what good teaching in STEM disciplines looks like. And so I did that for a couple of years. And then I kind of brought that energy and those ideas to JMU around the time that Karen Santos, my mentor at JMU, was starting the Center for Faculty Innovation, which is the center I helped to grow with her, while I was also assistant professor of biology. So I was now in a tenure track position at biology, and they were giving me a lot of freedom in terms of the kind of scholarship that I could do. So we got an NSF grant in the biology department to redo the curriculum. I was giving them workshops. I was doing SGIDs, small group instructional diagnoses, the mid-semester feedback. And Karen heard about me. And so we started working together, growing the center. And then next thing I know, I'm the executive director of the center, having, gotten tenure at JMU, had a full and beautiful career as a faculty member. And now I got to do this really great thing. I got to build this holistic center. As a faculty member, we believed that it was really important at JMU for us to maintain our faculty positions in our departments. So we hired people into those roles. That model actually still exists there, which is kind of cool. And so at some point, however, I realized that I was feeling a bit stretched. And I think it was also a little bit of a Groundhog Day syndrome, to be honest with you. I've been doing this work at this place a very long time. Yeah. And there was a part of me that thought that Karen was never going to retire. So when she did, and I got to be the director, I was like, well, I got to give this a go, right? Yeah. But then after about 6 years of being the director, I thought, I always wanted to start a center from scratch. So in my inbox comes this email from Colby College, and I was like, oh no, this is not in the geographically approved distance from Virginia that my spouse was going to entertain. But thankfully she came around, because it turned out to be a great opportunity for us and for me professionally to come to Colby and start a center at a place that hadn't really overthought it. They thought about it enough, but not so much that I felt constrained when I got here. I tell people a lot that my first year at Colby felt like a sabbatical. I had complete control over the throttle. I was able to read and think about some of the writing I wanted to do and some of the work that I wanted to do here. And so, now I'm in my 6th year here, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to finish my career in this kind of work. And but yet that biologist in me is still pretty strong. And so is the teacher in me. I mean, I don't get to teach as much as I used to. And I don't get to do a lot of biology, but at some point I'm going to go back to the classroom and teach biology. And so I'll get to feed that biologist in me and the teacher in me again. But for now, I'm helping to feed a whole lot of other teachers. So
you brought up a lot of really interesting issues and topics that we talk about on this podcast, one of which is this idea that many of us came out of faculty, but not all of us. And there is this perspective that maybe you should have served as a faculty member first. Maybe it's okay not to. What are your thoughts on this? Because I think that that's something, and it's not a make or break kind of thing, but what benefits do you think people have coming from faculty versus people who go straight into faculty development?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly cognizant of the fact that there's multiple pathways into the kind of work that we do now. Even then, when I was sort of entering into the field, I mean, I think I see the value of my experience as a faculty member is that I sort of, I've walked that walk. I know what it's like to walk into a classroom with 175 students. And in realizing that I can't try some of the really cool ideas that I just gave a workshop on. My classes are not a circus. I don't try everything that I, profess to the faculty that I work with. So I think, I have that kind of reality check, but that doesn't mean you have to be a faculty member to have experience doing that kind of teaching. So I think in some respects, it depends on the kind of work you're doing with faculty and how your center or the people who you work with position you in terms of how you are valued and respected and the credentials that you bring and the experiences that you bring. But I do think faculty respond better sometimes, and I don't really want to apologize for them, but I think that they just, they tend to be drawn to people that they know have had similar experiences to them. Yeah. I think kind of ironically, people at Colby think I'm a faculty member here. I mean, I'm not. And it's interesting because when I decided to come here and people were like, you're going to leave your faculty role? I'm like, yeah. I mean, I have essentially not been a faculty member prior to this for many, many years because I was running a center, I mean, sure, I was teaching a couple classes, but so, I mean, a lot of it's identity. So I think you just have to bring whatever identity you have. I mean, there's so many different ways you can get skill sets that that faculty value, and just sort of, own that. You just have to own your journey.
Yeah, I think, and that's really interesting. And I've struggled with the idea of identity. And in the first season of this podcast, we spent some time talking about what moving into a director position does to your identity, because I think it does have a profound impact on the groups that you interact with, in particular the professional organizations you're involved with. As you know, you and I know each other through NEFDC and now POD. And these are not organizations I was a part of 10 years ago, but they're incredibly important organizations to me now. And I think that as we evolve and we begin to look at how our careers map out, these organizations become important. But that said, you brought up a really interesting point about not just the journey, but the position. And I think your position, and I'm looking at your title, you have this title that carries with it a lot of responsibility. And I think that different institutions position these people differently as well. I carry a faculty title at my institution. I teach 1 or 2 classes a semester. I advise students, but I also have this administrative responsibility that takes me out of my department. That administrative responsibility grows over time as I think people become more integrated into the institution. And I guess I just sort of have to ask, do you think that as these roles evolve, we're going to have a more standard model, or do you think it's going to continue to be a model that fits the institution and the individual in ways that are different than faculty?
Yeah, that's a really good line of ideas to toss around. I think my sense of all of this comes from the notions that I began to realize when I was early into this work. So again, I'm first gen. So I'm at JMU and I'm sort of starting to be whatever, like the assistant director of a center. And I begin to realize like all these like naming conventions are just made up.
Yeah. Totally made up.
Like everything is just made up.
Yeah.
So I started to wonder, like, well, why do people put so much, emphasis, or like they think that certain titles are better than others, and I do think that comes from the particular institution you're at, right? So I think some language is pretty consistent across institutions: assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. But all the language that people use to describe our work, it's all over the place, right? So you could get lost in that. And I think it's a lot harder for faculty. If you've come from the faculty side, you can get lost in sort of worrying about what your title is, as opposed to just realizing that your title should sort of like fit the work you do. And it should allow you to work with the people that you want to work with, right? So like, I don't really care who the title is of the person who I report to, as long as that person helps empower my work and helps support me. And I don't really care what title I have, as long as it describes the work that I do enough so that I can understand what I'm supposed to be doing, but also so that other people can understand what they should expect from me, right? So my advice about titles and this whole like hierarchy of things is, like just just sort of be content with finding the work you want to do and make sure that it's situated in the ways that the institution will value it, and that you actually, sort of respect and trust the people you report to. I don't really see it consolidating around a sort of like a common language, Chris, but maybe it will. I don't know. It's variable, and I love that, actually.
Yeah,
it's so variable.
I'm a first gen too, and there's so much of higher ed that just sort of was like opening a Christmas present every day. Like I didn't know what was going on. I remember looking at my faculty member's degree. He was a psych professor, and I looked at his degree and it said Doctor of Philosophy. I thought, he's a philosopher as well as a psychologist? Oh my God. I didn't know what that meant. And right. And so as I've gone through, I'm like, you titles mean very little to me, except for what they allow me to do to, as you said, empower me to do to make the biggest impact on the people I want to work with. And again, the title up to doesn't matter to me as long as that person can give me the ability to do that. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because our jobs, and I'm sort of leading you to some of the things that you do, but our jobs are so varied with regards to what our responsibilities are and the kinds of ways we carry out our responsibilities. And I think the thing that we have in common is, for many of us, we have responsibility without some of the authority we might need for some of our responsibilities. And so we have to trade on our ability to work with people. But I also think that because of that kind of ambiguity, a lot of us just do things. And I think that's kind of cool. Like, I just do things sometimes until someone says, Chris, that's not you shouldn't. Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know. And I think that's a way to get things done that's effective. So I really appreciate your thoughts on this. Let me ask you, one of the things that I like to do in this season of the podcast is get a feel for things that you do in your center, events, activities, workshops, whatever, that you think have been incredibly effective and impactful. And how do you know that they've had the impact that you would really like them to have?
Yeah. So when I came to Colby, I had this wonderful experience that, working at the center at JMU for something like 10 years, where, I was in the weeds. I was running all these programs. I was like, I'd come back from a pod conference and be like, oh my God, Karen, we've got to try this and this and this. And I would try all of this stuff. Right. So when I got to Colby, I thought, I got to start with like a core set of programs that I think really matter. Mm-hmm. And so instead of getting distracted by sort of maybe the desire to put out a whole bunch of stuff to let them know, like, oh, here it is, the CTL, bam, right? Yeah. I'm a center of one at this point, right? I'm at a school that has about a couple thousand students, a couple hundred faculty. So I leaned on what I thought for me was the most influential program that I feel like I've ever really experienced as a director, as a member of a center, and as a faculty member. So I started an SGID program, and I did that intentionally alongside of some programs that I was offering to pull faculty into the strategic planning process that I was developing. I didn't really have an advisory board yet, and I wanted everybody to feel welcome to that. So I offered, my first workshop was on how to collect mid-semester feedback. And from that, I invited some of those people to get an SGID. Now, here at Colby, we call it a MISCA, mid-semester course analysis. And the reason why I wanted to start there was I feel like SGID gives us, as educational developers, opportunities to build a really strong relationship with the professor, the instructor, and to get to know the students. Something I really needed to do here at Colby, because I didn't know any, I hadn't taught here. I needed to have these ideas and conversations. And so my first semester, I don't really remember how many I did, probably like 20, which is, quite significant number for one person. And that program is still running and thriving, and it is the core of, sort of the programming. So when the pandemic hit, we kept doing mid-semester feedback sessions. We figured out a way to do it, right? So from there, then I put out the decorative stuff, because this campus was actually really interested in workshops. I'm like, okay, I'm actually not so sure we do very many workshops anymore in the traditional sense. I think we're struggling coming out of the pandemic with that. So I did some of that stuff, and maybe that's the thing I need to figure out how to make vibrant again for me, because I feel like people come to a workshop, maybe they get a good idea, maybe they don't, they go back to their offices, and then nothing really happens. So I don't feel like there's a lot, like an investment in making something happen out of a workshop. But a MISCA, an SGID, a mid-semester feedback session where I sit down with you, Chris, and I tell you what your students told me is like crazy feedback that you've never heard before, wrapped up in this kind of conversation that I have with them about learning. So that program, I feel like, is a really high impact program, because you see the effect almost immediately. Faculty, we actually have like this follow-up luncheon where people who got one of these feedback sessions come back, and we sit around and talk about how did this influence your classes. And it's so amazing to hear the ways that they talk about it. I run into students on campus. They're like, that's the best thing that you've ever done. How can you get more of those to happen? Right. So I don't need to I collect some survey data on it, but I don't really need to, because you see it. It's like immediate impact, right? Yeah,
it's funny that you bring that. So I have students they'll email me after and tell me more, and I think it's really interesting. But one of the things that you said I find fascinating, and that is, as I've gotten into this, and it sounds exactly like what you're doing, is that the idea of the workshop is people would say tried and true, but I see it as being and I tell people this all the time, it's like I am Def Leppard on tour. And all I want to do is sell records to individuals. I'm just out there getting people interested because that's kind of fun. But what really matters is when I get one-on-one and I sell them the record and they listen to my record, or I get them in the office, I can talk to them about things. So the workshops are the pretty stuff, the window dressing, to get people to do the real work. And I think that centers more and more are moving in that direction. And, we have these conversations, these workshops. I don't expect to get a lot out of that, except for the 3 faculty members who will reach out to me and follow up with me. That's where the rubber meets the road. And I think that especially at small schools like what we're doing, where we're smaller organizations and centers trying to operate things. I mean, you talk to some of these people. I had a conversation with another center director who is a center director of a massive center that has dozens and dozens of people. And that's a different job. It's just a different job. And what they do is what we are able to do, but in a grander scale. So that's terrific. And I think that if you are starting a center, I think that advice is really helpful for people to identify a program that you think can be the cornerstone of what you do and build around that. That's great. So you brought up the idea of going to pod and coming back with lots of ideas. And I think anyone's been to pod, you come back with lots of ideas and you want to try stuff. And it's like my first teaching conference I went to, and I watched someone do a workshop like that. I want to do a workshop like that. And I realized I can't do that. That's not who I am. Same thing with some of these programs, right? So are there things that you went and you tried and you think it didn't just quite do exactly what you wanted to do, or something that you might have tried to do differently?
So the answer to that question is the faculty learning communities.
Oh, yeah.
I got, there's obviously a lot of sessions at Pod about it, but I also went to the conference that Milton Cox was doing back in the day on faculty learning communities. And to me, it just seems like such the perfect program. And so I remember starting my first one at JMU, like on teaching large classes or something like that. And it's just like, they stopped coming. And I just didn't expect that. Right. And now, of course, I expect it. So then I'm trying to design around it. And I just feel like they just never realize the sort of like kind of maybe over idealized dreams I have for them. So like, I just think, okay, well, we're going to have a faculty learning community and we're going to have, 10 people say they're going to come and 5 are going to actually come. And then 2 are going to come regular, so like I almost defeat myself before the whole thing gets started. And we can call it something different. We can call it a community of practice. We can, so you and I both know that programming that lasts over, more than just one workshop's allotment of time has, is also that like kind of sweet spot. So to me, a faculty learning community seems like that sweet spot.
Yeah.
So I went through phases where I thought, okay, well, maybe it's me. Maybe I don't really need to be a part of all these communities. Maybe they can take the lead and they can own them. Maybe I'm just not equipped correctly or whatever. I'm never able to pass that baton, either if they started on their own or if I get them started in the past. It just seems to all run stale or flat. So I keep trying, but I wonder if I'll just finally, concede that this is not the kind of programming that I have the skill set to run, or I don't know what, but it frustrating is not the word I would use for it. It's just massive disappointment, I think.
Yeah. And I think we all have them. And I think that's really, it's similar to teaching and the way we go about teaching our classes. And when we see people do things that we think are really fantastic, and then we try it and it falls flat. And I think that's what we have to recognize is, like we tell our faculty, you need to be authentic to who you are as a faculty member. You need to be authentic to who you are as a faculty developer, and work with the strengths that you have. That will support faculty better than if you try to do a bunch of things that aren't as successful or not as within your wheelhouse, because then it feels like you're trying to force this thing in. The faculty learning communities are interesting because what you described, I mean, you tell me someone who doesn't experience that. 10 people, 5, 2. That's what happens. And people start off great. You buy them a book. They're like, oh, I got a book. I'm going to read every page. And then they've read a chapter, and then next, like they just drop off after a while. And you have to do some of these so people see that you're constantly trying to engage people in different ways. But it's sometimes an overuse of resources that you don't need to do. So I hear you on these things. I'm curious. And this is a question I didn't prep you for, but I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit about this. I have found that in faculty development, I have leaned heavily on people outside of my organization because I've typically been a center of one, or I've had a few staff members. Right now, I have a couple of graduate students who are great, but they're also graduate students. Do you find that the community that we have in faculty development is a community that is able to really provide the kinds of resources and needs filled that we need? And now I know as incoming president of POD, I'm not looking for you to tout POD or not, but I guess I'm trying to look for that notion of identity. And do you think as we evolve as a discipline, there are places for identity for people out there in the field, the way that a lot of the academic disciplines have really parsed themselves into small organizations? The reason I ask is, and I'll let you answer in a second, but I'm in APA in psychology, but really I'm in Division 2 of APA, which is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's my niche. I don't do anything else with APA, just do that niche. And I'm wondering if you see faculty development going that way as we get a bigger field, that if there's going to be these groups that help people.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the sort of, if you think about something like POD and NEFDC, they're very similar kinds of organizations, yet they do serve sort of a slightly different audience. I think NEFDC is focused a little bit more on bringing traditional faculty in. I think POD also brings some traditional faculty in, but I think it's been growing as an organization to be more a place for educational developers. So I'm not so sure, I'm thinking about this from my career, across my career. I think I went to my first POD conference back in 2003 when I was just starting to do some of this faculty development work. So I was mostly faculty. So I have felt that throughout my career, whatever I've needed has always been at POD for me. There has been enough stuff to feed the teacher in me as well as the educational developer in me. I don't know. I think that's still the case, but I'd have to kind of look at it from take a few steps back. But before I left JMU, I would always bring my entire staff with me as much as we could afford to POD. And, my sense was that all levels of my staff were still getting something out of it. And organizationally, we got something out of it as well. And, and POD now for me and NEFDC as well is a place where I'm strengthening networks and I'm creating opportunities to write and think. I don't go as many sessions as I might have used to at POD. And I'm thinking about ways of situating, my faculty to interact with POD and NEFDC. So I do think that both of those organizations are going to continue to evolve and start to serve, sort of the need. And POD, I think the need is we are maturing as educational developers. The conference and the organization needs to mature with us. I think there are other organizations that are also going to start filling in the gaps, like all the DBER, the discipline-based educational research. That's a particular kind of thing that sometimes you can find aspects of that in POD, sometimes you can't. I think the disciplinary teaching conferences also are going to fill a particular niche for some of the faculty development crew. I think, sort of ISED is also very much so. The International Educational Development Group is very, very much like POD in terms of the ways that the conference is supporting work. When I go to those conferences, I feel that I'm also at a POD-like experience where it's for educational developers. I don't think back in 2003 that was as much of its identity. So I think it has a lot to do with us, Chris. How we are changing over time, because we are, in fact, the organizations that we are, attending and being a part of. So I don't know. I think maybe in 10 years, I hope that traditional faculty are still going to POD, but I think maybe not to the extent that they are now.
Yeah, interesting. So my first POD was 2010, and I was a faculty member, and I was thinking about starting a teaching center, and it was an experience, like you said, right? There were things for me in different areas. Now I had been involved in the Society for Teaching of Psychology, so I had been to disciplinary-based teaching conferences, but it was a really interesting shift. And I remember talking to Todd Zakryzek, who was trying to tell me the difference between Lilly and POD and what the focus was. And it was really interesting to talk to Todd about that because they are different, but at the time I didn't see the difference. And I think that is in part, these conferences are developing their niches, but also, as you said, we are as well. So I think it's an interesting way to think about it. Thanks, Carol. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate chatting with you. And I hope that your presidential year at Pod is fantastic. And I really appreciate you taking the time today.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris.